Hey, Nick here, and in this video I'm going to show you everything you need to know about the HTTP module in make.com. This is going to be the most comprehensive tutorial that you will find on this topic on the internet. I'm going to cover every single field in the HTTP module. I'm going to talk about how to use and structure various requests, and then after some theory, we're actually going to dive deep into me practically using the HTTP module to connect to 4 different APIs, all with their own authentication methods. So if you've worried or struggled with connecting HTTP modules to various APIs in the past, or you guys just want to brush up on your skills, then this is the video for you. Let's get into it. So the HTTP module that I'm going to be focusing on in particular, well, they're really going to be 2. The first is the make a request module, which is how the vast majority of API requests in make.com are going to occur. And then I'm also going to cover the make an OAuth 2.0 request. Now, you might be asking yourself, Nick, why are you only covering these 2? And it's because I've made over $1 million with make.com up until this point, and I've basically never used any of these other modules. I just haven't needed to. So as most of my course and training materials on Make talk about, I'm only really worried about the highest ROI bits. I'm worried about the parts that you're going to end up using 99% of the time, not all these random edge cases. I do use the get a file from time to time, but that's not really the purpose of this video. So know that this video is not going to turn you into a web developer. You're not going to walk away from this with a computer science degree, unfortunately, but it is the 80-20. If you've wanted to learn how to make HTTP requests, what the hell all of that fancy stuff in like the Chrome developer tool console means, what the responses in make.com when you make an HTTP request are, then this is the video for you. I'm also going to show you how to successfully make the vast majority of API calls that you will ever need. As I mentioned to you, there are a few different types. I'm going to connect to 4 different APIs, but there are a couple different subgroups that they all fall under. And once you learn this, you can basically connect anything that you want into Make, even if there's no like native module. I'm also going to be reading some API documentation alongside you, and I figure this is going to help you guys learn some of the more tacit knowledge sort of steps here involved in making API requests successfully, because every API is a little bit different. All right, so what do you need to know? You could spend years going to school to learn thousands of little edge cases with APIs, or I could just walk you through what 99% of those HTTP requests and API calls are really going to look like in practice. So here's what we're going to cover over the course of the next little bit. The first is we're going to cover what is HTTP. We're going to talk about how it works, where it came from, and basically just all the stuff that you need to know in order to be able to read documentation that relies on HTTP requests. The second is, how do I connect with APIs, and what are some examples? The third is, what are the 3 main types of API requests, which I'm going to be covering in detail. And then the fourth is, how does JSON work? I get this question a lot, Nick. How do I learn JSON? Do I need to know JSON before I get deeper into make.com? The truth is that you don't, but if you're watching this video, it's probably because you're already at a certain skill level, and JSON is just the natural next step for you. So we're going to be talking about that. The last thing is, can you show me how to connect to APIs? And I'm actually going to be walking through 3 to 4 of those connections, just so that you can pattern match, so you can see what I'm doing. You can be like, okay, he keeps on clicking that field. That field must be important, right? All right, so let's get into it. Let me just zoom this out a little bit. I'm going to make this video 4K, so you guys are going to be able to see all the text. Let's talk a little bit about HTTP requests. HTTP stands for the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And I know that when you see 4-letter acronyms, and the internet freaking loves 4-letter acronyms for some reason, but when you see these, you know, immediately a lot of alarm bells are probably going off in your head, like, oh shit, that's computer nerd stuff. How the hell am I supposed to understand this? I just want to make some money. Well, it's okay. Nick is here. When they say protocol, protocols are just an established way of doing things. To send an HTTP request just means that you are formatting a bunch of text in a very particular way that some dude invented back in 1989. I think it was Tim Pool. I might be mistaken. But somebody invented this back in 1989. And then because the internet is so iterative, because everything builds on itself, right? After he invented this HTTP framework, you know, a bunch of people voted on it, a bunch of people shook hands. And it's basically just been what we've been stuck with ever since. So if you want to send a request to a web server, you basically need to know how to structure it and package it in the HTTP way, right? Using the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So the structure itself includes a few key components, and I'm not going to run through every component, but these are the 4 ones that you actually need to know. The first one is called the URL. Now, if you've ever wondered what a URL stood for, it stands for Universal Resource Locator, and that's it. So if I were to go back into Make here, and then if I were to open up a module, let me just delete everything here and make this like from scratch. This URL module, or this URL field over here rather, that's referring to the universal resource locator. Luckily, all of us already know what that is. URL is just a web address. So google.com, that's a URL. Leftclick.ai, that's my website, that's a URL. Amazon.com, these are all universal resource locators. As the name sort of points to, this is just meant to be like a way to locate any resource on the internet and to do it universally, right? So that's number one. The second thing is called a method. And if we go back to our HTTP module here, you'll see that there is a method field. And by the way, if you're unfamiliar, anything in make.com where the text is bolded like this, that's a required field, meaning you have to select a method, you have to select a URL, basically in order to click OK and have this work. If I remove this, it's going to tell me that the value must not be empty. So these are required pieces of information. The method field here is broken into a bunch of different options, and these were really intimidating to me when I first started out. But the good news is you're not actually going to need the vast majority of options on this screen. After several years of working with make.com and several more years of just making HTTP requests on the internet outside of make.com, here are the only ones that I actually use. I only ever use get, which is sort of like one of the first ways to request information on the internet, to access a resource, sort of the old way. Post, which I like to think of as just a modern GET request, but it's also a way that you can like add data to an API or a resource or update a database. And then put. And put is basically like, I talked about updating. Some APIs split adding resources and updating resources into two different methods. And so post would be an adding a resource, and then put would be like updating a resource. This doesn't really make any sense in theory. So, if I were to discuss this practically, let's say you had a I don't know, like a ClickUp CRM, and you had a bunch of leads in the CRM with email addresses, first names, and last names. When you call the ClickUp API, like when you send a request to the ClickUp module, what you're really doing is you're sending a post request with a bunch of fields in it that basically say, hey, I want to add a new record, or hey, I want to delete a record. When you send a put request, what you're doing is you're basically providing the ID of a specific record, and you're saying, hey, I want to update this, I want to change this. I don't actually know if ClickUp uses put, but that's more or less how that works. So those are the only three that you actually really need to know. And in practice, as I've said, I've made well over $1 million with make.com at this point. I actually have to like sit back and add it up. It's probably over $1.5 million now, maybe even 2 million. These are the only ones that I ever use, and they're probably the only ones that you're ever going to use too. Okay, so that's URL, that's method. Let's talk a little bit about headers. Headers are just structured key value pairs that most servers look for. What is a key value pair? Well, if I open up this headers array and if I just click add a new record, you'll see that it asks for two fields. One called name, and in make.com a name is just a key. And then the second is a value. So if I were to say ID equals 30FE8, presumably this is the ID or identifier of some resource that I'm calling, like a ClickUp record or maybe a row in my Google Sheet or something like that. What I've done here is I've basically added a structured key value pair to the header. Now the headers, somebody just, as I mentioned, this guy Tim or whoever it was that invented this back in 1989, they basically just said, hey, we just have some format here where, at the beginning of the request, we need to add a bunch of headers. Because maybe we want the headers to be standardized. Maybe they were thinking a little bit about like cookies, 10 or 15 years from now. They were just thinking about like all the information that they could put in here and how if they standardized it, it'd be much easier for people to send and receive requests. And that's really the name of the game here. The internet is very standardized now, including HTTP requests, which is why you have these conventions. So realistically, headers are stuff nowadays like this. User agent, Mozilla /5.0. There's like a standard header called the user agent, which just typically tells a website, hey, what am I using to browse this? There's dimensions of the browser. It like tells them how big the browser is, for instance. You can imagine how this information might be useful to the server because one, it'll help them track you and develop evil cookie monitoring ad services, but second, and probably more importantly, is they'll actually be able to like cater the content to people at either that specific screen size or people that are using that specific browser or what have you. The header that really matters for us today is going to be the authorization header. And the authorization header is just a standard, it's a convention that a lot of APIs use to send and receive requests using an API key. And the authorization header just looks like this. You literally just, the key is called authorization with a capital A. And then the value is always the word bearer plus a space. And then, API key goes here. So pretend I had a big API key like this. What I would do is I would write authorization in the key, and then I would write bearer, and then I'd add a space, just like this with capital B and everything. And then I just paste in my API key. And I'll actually connect to several APIs using this exact method in a few minutes. So you can add basically an infinite number of headers. And as I mentioned, there are a bunch of templated headers. There's like cookie, for instance. There are a bunch of different types of cookies. So just keep that in mind. Header is just a way to structure that information. Okay, and then the last sort of way or main component in an HTTP request is called a request content, or the request body. And the request content is just this section down over here. We see it says request content. You know how earlier we had, let's just say ID, and let's just do this. If this were in our header, for instance, you could also, let me actually do the authorization example. What you'll find, and what I'll talk about in a minute, is that some APIs like when the API key is formatted like this, but other APIs actually prefer the API key to be formatted like this. And this format here is called JSON. JSON is still split into key value pairs. It's just written in this specific format that I've showed you with curly braces and quotes and keys wrapped in these quotes with colons in between them, and then some closing curly brace. So I'll get into the specifics of these formatting pieces in a moment, but for now just know that, again, this is just a protocol that we agreed on forever ago, before I was born, that's for sure. And ever since then, the internet and really the world at large has just been using this convention to send and receive standardized info. So as I mentioned down here, there are a couple of finer points, but I never really use them. And if you're building an automation business that actually makes money, you probably won't either. You're just going to use those two modules that I showed you earlier, the make a request module 95% of the time, and then the make an OAuth 2 request module the other 5% of the time. So that's what we'll cover. And then I'll actually give you some practical examples with the HTTP modules in a moment. But first, I want to talk a little bit about APIs, okay? And how you can turn this module basically into any other module you want. Like this HTTP make a request module, if you format it right, it will be functionally equivalent to this Canva created design module. It's just instead of Make and Canva having done the heavy lifting for you, you're actually going to build out that connection yourself. All right. In terms of APIs, we have a very fancy diagram over here, which I definitely did not just search up the word API diagram on Google Images and then just copy the first result. That would be bad. But we have a laptop over here, which is you, and then it sends a request to an API, which is connected to a server. You can just think of these as one for simplicity. And then the server and the API, they'll send a response back, and that response will be formatted a particular way. It'll go back into your computer, and then voila, you'll get some data. Now, because we're using make.com, which is a cloud service, our diagram doesn't actually look like that. Our diagram, instead of the U is like make.com. So, excuse me, any request that you're sending, you're not sending from yourself, you're sending it from make.com, and that's an important distinction. So what does an API actually stand for? API stands for Application Programming Interface. And to be honest, I think it's just one of the dumbest names anybody could have ever used to encapsulate this idea. The whole idea essentially is that this is an interface. The internals of the API process in your server are a black box, so you can only access it through the interface. But I just think that it's really silly, and I just hate how the internet and computer scientists at large have just turned everything into 3 or 4 letter acronyms, which don't really provide a lot of convenience for people that are learning this for the first time. That's okay. This basically just refers to a server that you'll send something to receive something else. What you'll send, as we show here, is the request, and what you receive is the response. So people always talk about HTTP requests. What was the response body? What was all that stuff? That's basically it. When it's a request, it's what you're sending. When it's a response, it's what they're sending back to you. Now, APIs are kind of like, user accounts. They're kind of like, they require a password, essentially. And the password to access an API is typically just referred to as the API key. So this is a password that allows you to access your specific account. And because it's a password, you typically have to be quite careful with those things. You don't want to expose your API key, and you don't want to show it to everybody. Because a lot of the time, APIs are connected to the pricing of some software service. So Maybe you only have 100 API requests per month on the $5 plan, and then if you go past that, now you're paying $50. Well, if you expose your API key, and there's some douchebag out there on the internet, as there always is, who copies it and uses it to make his own requests, well, now you're sort of going to be up shit creek without a paddle, as I believe they say. But that's all theory. Let's actually make things practical. Why don't I actually show you what this might look like in reality? Well, I have a service here that I talk about pretty often called Any Mail Finder, and I love these guys because they, I've been using them basically nonstop, like literally once a day probably for the last goddamn 4 or 5 months, something like that. They're really cost-effective, like email enrichment service. If you're unfamiliar with email enrichment, basically, they will try and find an email address for you at a specific domain or something. So this is what the interface looks like. And basically the way that it works is, if you're using the user interface, if you're using like the typical, the graphic user interface, the GUI, if you wanted to find a person at a domain, you just supply the domain and then you'd supply their full name. So Nick Sarayev at leftclick.ai. And what you see is it just created a little new row and it says, hey, we found an email at leftclick.ai, Nick at leftclick.ai, which actually turns out to be my email, which you will not do bad things with. And then, this is basically like the workflow, right? But accessing this GUI is super annoying. Like it just sucks to have to go in here every time. What if you had 10,000 domains that you really quickly wanted to check the full names and email addresses of? What are you going to do? Sit here like a monkey and just copy and paste them in for hours? No, obviously not. And that's where APIs come in handy. And so Any Mail Finder has an API where you're supplying an API key, and you can use that API key to make requests to the Any Mail Finder API. And so what I'm going to be showing you guys later is I will literally copy this API key, which is like my password, but it's not a big deal because I can rotate it right after this video. That means I can just switch it. But I can use that API key in a request to basically supply all of the same information I just supplied here. There'll be a field for leftclick.ai, my domain name. There'll be a field for my full name. There'll be a domain for whether it's a person search, a decision maker search, a company search, right? I could supply all of that information just using JSON instead of what I'm doing here, and then it'll go out and it'll do it for me. It'll do the thing and return a result. So that's more or less it. We're going to send an HTTP request to Any Mail Finder's API. Their server's going to do some fun magic. I don't know what sort of like black wizardry they're doing down there, but you'll receive a response with the enriched email. Most platforms that you've probably used up until now in make.com will have built-in API connections. Like for instance, let's say I wanted to use this Canva module here, right? The get an asset. So essentially what Canva has done is they have gone to their API and then they've written all the code to call a specific part of their API, and then they've just packaged it into a module here for us to access. And so now we don't actually have to do all the heavy lifting in order to do it. All we have to do is just drag and drop a module and then go over here and then click create a connection, where we just have one little login screen and then we're good. They're still using APIs. That's exactly what they're doing. But what we're going to do now is we're assuming that the service that you want to connect to doesn't have an API, so you sort of have to do it yourself. That's why knowing this is so powerful. It more or less lets you create your own modules anytime that you want. And I consider it a requirement, really, if you want to scale up your make.com, just in general, your automation workflows. Okay, we got a little bit more theory here, and then we're going to dive into the practical bit. There are 3 main types of API requests. Now I'm saying because the internet is made by people and people are very opinionated, and usually people will agree on something and then somebody later will come by and say, why the hell are they doing it like that? That sounds dumb. I'm going to invent my own thing. Essentially, because everybody has their own opinions about the best way to do things, several conventions have arisen around how API requests should be formatted, where you should put the API key. What's the most secure method of going about it, and how do you balance that security against the ease of use and integratability and all that stuff. So there are actually hundreds, if not thousands, of different ways that, some random API over there is going to format it that way, and this other API is going to format it the other way. But in practice, I find that they all fall into 3 main categories, 3 main umbrellas. The first is that you'll put your API keys in a header. The second is that you'll put your API keys in the request content. And the third, and this is the hardest one for many people to understand, and this is a question I get in my community all the time, is you'll connect via OAuth 2, which I'll cover later. And I'm going to show you examples of each. There's really no fundamental difference, just a few minor changes to the steps of the API request. But before I do that, just to show you what this means in practice, We've actually already gone through this module, right? We've seen the URL, the method, the headers, and then the request content. So the first way is you just put your API keys in a header. So just as I mentioned here with the authorization bearer, you just do something like this. And sometimes it's authorization bearer, sometimes it's X API key, and then you remove the bearer part. Sometimes it's like the service itself. I think Phantom Buster is like this, for instance. And I'm going to use their API call later. But essentially, you just put them in the header. The second main way is you put it in the request content. And so you actually have something like this that says API key. You write it just like this, and then you send it in a post request specifically. You can't do a get request, it has to be a post. And I'll show you an example of that later. And then the third is you forego this module entirely, and then instead use a module called the make an OAuth 2.0 request, where you actually have to manually create a connection by essentially doing a little bit more complicated of an authentication flow, where you have to get a client ID, a client secret, an authorize URI, a token URI, a bunch of bullshit, more or less. It's a lot more secure bullshit for sure, but for people that are just getting started, it just seems a lot more complex. Regardless, it's all right. It's really not that hard, and I'm going to show you how to do. I'm going to show you how to do it in a moment. The last thing that we need to do in order to really deeply understand HTTP requests and then how to make API calls is we need to understand JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. JavaScript is a programming language primarily used on the internet. JavaScript objects are particular ways of writing information that are wrapped in these little curly braces. So JavaScript object notation is basically where, regardless of whether or not we're using JavaScript, we're writing about a resource just using that very specific convention with a very specific protocol, very specific language. So just like HTTP, some people shook hands, 25 years ago and said, 35 years ago, and said, this is how, we're going to format our requests. JavaScript was sort of a collaborative effort where a bunch of people said, okay, this is how we're going to do the format with the curly braces and the quotes and all that stuff. JavaScript object notation really is nothing scary. If you just stare at it for 10 minutes, you will get it, and you'll be able to deal with so many more possibilities and opportunities in Make. The issue is most people just don't get it explained to them in this way, and so they always think of JSON as this very intimidating sort of like black box where you have to ask GPT-4 for or something like that. Historically, getting JSON right was a pain in the ass because you'd spend 30 seconds, looking at an example JSON request, and then you'd format it the same way and you'd send it, and then it would say error, 400 requests, invalid data, whatever. You'd be like, what the hell's going on? You'd stare at it line by line, and then finally you'd realize that you forgot a little square bracket or curly bracket or something. But nowadays, if that ever happens to you, you can just get AI to fix it in like 2 seconds. You just copy and paste your JSON, you send it to AI, and you say, hey, can you fix this JSON? What's wrong with it? And it'll explain it to you. So what we're going to do next is we're just going to stare at the below examples, and I'm going to walk you through basically how JSON works. Not entirely, but in a high ROI way. Again, I'm going to do the 80-20. I'm going to cut out all the stuff that doesn't super important, like extremely matter. So first things first, what is this over here in the top left-hand corner? Well, this is probably the simplest JSON structure you could possibly have. Notice how we have a left curly bracket that starts the object. Then we have a quote, and then we have a key, which I'm calling username. Then we have another quote. So from there, you could see that the keys are wrapped in quotes. Then we have a colon. That's very important. And then we have the value. And in this case, the value is also wrapped in quotes. And then when you want to finish your object, you just have to make sure that the number of open curly braces and the number of closed curly braces match. So this here is an object. You could imagine how this object might refer to a character in a video game. Maybe my username is King Nick, right? And I'm going to carry that example forward with you through a few more of these. Essentially, all you need to know is that you're going to have some quoted thing on the left-hand side, and that's going to be your key. And then you're going to have something on the right-hand side. This thing doesn't need to be quoted, which I'll get to in a second. And then between them, you're just going to have a colon. These are your key value pairs. Let's look at another example here. This is a more complex example, but this is probably at the level where most of the API requests that you are formatting and sending and receiving will be. So in this example, we have the exact same thing that we had before. It's just instead of closing our JSON with another curly brace, what we've done is we've extended it and we've added multiple options. And the way that you add multiple options in JSON is you just add a little comma here, right? So I have a little comma right after username King Nick. And that just is a convention that says, hey, this is going to be more than one. We're going to add multiple. Anytime you want to add another, you just add another comma. So now, in addition to username King Nick, we also have a level key. And that level key has a little colon behind it. The value of that level key is 42. Now, I've wrapped this 42 in quotes, but you don't actually have to wrap numbers in quotes. Some APIs want numbers formatted with quotes, and then other APIs, for whatever reason, do not want numbers formatted with quotes. This is a computer science principle, essentially called typecasting or something like that. Make will typecast everything essentially to a string most of the time, or it'll try and intelligently typecast it for you. So for most instances, you don't need to know specifically what type of variable it is, but in some you may. So if you ever have some error where you try and call a video game API and feed them in username KingNick with level 42, and it says, improperly formatted JSON, just think to yourself, okay, maybe it's the number. Maybe I'll just take the quotes off, try again. Odds are it's going to work. Okay, and then down here we have a relatively big deviation from what we've done so far, which is instead of having keys and values just both wrapped in quotes, now we have another key called skills, then a colon, but the value this time isn't just a string. The value this time is an array. And arrays in JSON start with a square bracket and then end with a square bracket on the right-hand side. And so arrays are just basically like a list of different values separated by commas. And if you've worked with arrays in make.com before, you sort of instinctively understand how this will work. Just make sure to wrap every string in these quotes here, and then you can have as many as you want. So in my case, this is an object here that describes a username of King Nick, a level of 42, and then an array of skills that includes walking and running. My video game character is very boring. So I mentioned that skills is an array. You have multiple values wrapped in square brackets. Play around with this. There are a bunch of websites out there that allow you to format JSON however you want. You could add another comma here and then say swordplay or something like that. You could add another comma here, and hypothetically you could say 39, right? Whether that's a skill or not, I don't know. But again, we're just making shit up at this point. The point I'm making is you have multiple different data types buried within an array. So in reality, the thing above, the second you start adding more like complicated data types like arrays and stuff like that, it gets pretty hard to read. So most people will just indent it, and they have a very specific way to indent it, where basically every time there's a curly bracket, you will do a tab to the right after, and then you're basically going to have a small little space. So let me show you a more complicated JSON structure that includes everything that we've talked about so far, just with one additional layer of complexity. So we have this opening curly bracket, but then instead of jumping right into the username, what we've done is we've added a key called user, and then we've added a colon, and then check this out. We've actually embedded another JavaScript object inside of the value of that user key. And this is really the final piece to the puzzle. This allows JSON to become arbitrarily complex because now you can nest multiple objects within key value pairs. And you could have a key with an object as a value with a bunch of keys that have their own objects as values. And in this way, you can get like 20 layers deep. I'll be frank though, APIs that typically do get you 20 layers deep are typically shitty APIs. There's usually no need for the data to be like that crazy deep and nested essentially. So some of the times it's just something that you have to deal with. Personally, the best APIs that I find the easiest ones to use, they go maybe like 1, 2, 3 layers deep at most. The good news is all of this is easily understood by make.com because there are modules that parse this automatically, that turn this into variables that you can just access with dragging and dropping a module like we normally do. So we have a user key, and then inside we have another object here. And if you think about it, this object starts with this curly bracket and then ends with this curly bracket, right? Because we have to have the number of open brackets equal to the number of closed brackets, and this is the next successive curly bracket. So this whole object here starts here. And then inside of it, we have a user key with another object here. And inside of that user key, we have a key called ID with King Nick, level, which is now just a number 42. And then again, we have an array of skills, which are walking and running. And as I mentioned down here, you can nest infinitely. Okay, so that's the 80-20 with JSON. To be honest, I think that that's all you're really going to need in order to get out there and start practically understanding what is JSON when you send a request and then you receive a response from a server. Let's actually take this information out now, and let's actually go connect to some APIs. Let me show you how to do all of this theory, but in practice. So the first API I'm going to connect to is called AnyMailFinder. As I've shown you guys previously, you can easily enrich or find an email using the GUI. Just going to exit out of full screen here so I can bounce around a little bit easier. What I have over here is I have an HTTP and API playground. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to rename this, and I'll just call this Any Mail Finder. This is just going to be like our test module. Then every time I connect to another API, I'm just going to create a new module, and then we're just going to run them all independently. Okay, so I want to connect to Any Mail Finder. Well, what do I need to do? The thing that most of these websites have is they'll supply you some type of API documentation. And so anytime you want to connect to the API of a service, typically what I do is I just type Any Mail Finder API. I'll just add the word API at the end of the service. And here we have the Email Finder API documentation for Any Mail Finder. And this is basically what all API documentation is going to look like, because they have a couple of custom, templated like libraries that make API documentation. So usually on the left-hand side, you'll have like some sort of table of contents. And in the middle here, you'll have a bunch of data. And on the right-hand side, if it's a good API, they'll actually give you some examples of the way to format the requests and receive the responses. So here we have the Any Mail Finder API. What I'll always do when I access one of these APIs is I'll very quickly read to see what the authentication looks like. So I'm scrolling through here. Okay, they talk about rate limits. Our API does not have rate limits. That's awesome. A rate limit just means if you send too many requests, eventually they will just cap it out and they'll say, sorry, you can only send 10. All right, so now we're already getting to the juicy part, it's the authentication. So all requests require authentication. To authenticate, you'll need to set an authorization header with the API key you find in your settings as a value. For example, if your API key is secret_key_123, you will want to add an authorization header with the value bearer space secret_key_123. If you guys remember, this is the first way to authenticate that I showed you guys earlier. You basically need to put a header, and that header needs to have the key authorization and the value bearer space whatever your API key is. So that's awesome, very convenient, and I most definitely did not plan this. So first thing that we have to do is we have to go to our your settings as value. So I'm going to open up a new tab, and you see we have an API key over here, which is awesome. So I'm going to copy this API key. Then I'm going to go back to make.com, open up an Any Mail Finder tab, and then all I'm going to do for now is I'm going to add this authorization header. This is going to be the format of our API request. I'm going to click OK for now because we haven't learned anything more about this API. We want to see how to send a request and basically enrich an email. Let me just exit out of that. Okay, great. Now it's time for us to basically figure out what exactly we want to do, right? And what I want to do is I want to send a company domain like I did earlier, leftclick.ai, and I want to send a full name, and I want it to return me the results. I want it to say nick at leftclick.ai, just like this example gave us back over here. The way that we do this is usually on the left-hand side, there'll be, as I mentioned, a table of contents, but these table of contents will all be different endpoints. An endpoint is just a universal resource locator that's specific to a function. So one function might be search for an email. Well, that'll be a universal resource locator that points somewhere else. Search for all emails on a domain, that'll be a different universal resource locator. So I'm going to click on search for an email, and you see it's going to go all the way down here. And it's going to say use our post/v5.0/search/person/JSON endpoint to find an individual's email. Well, that's great, but what the hell does that mean? Anytime you see a slash and then you see an ending like this, this is referred to as a relative universal resource locator, or a relative URL. It means that you need to figure out what the base URL is. Now, fortunately, in this case, they're nice enough to provide us an explicit example of what their root URL is, which in this case is api.anymailfinder.com. This is the root here. And then the v5.0 and stuff, that's just everything that comes after. But in some instances, you won't be able to. And I find in practice, most APIs are like nameofthething.com/API, or they're api.nameofthething.com. So that's your root. But as you see, it's as easy as this. They actually provide us an example request content or request body to send. And what I'm going to do is I'm literally just going to copy all of this JSON, and I'm just going to replace it with my own shit. And if I'm honest, that's 99% of what my job is. I just find an example request, then I go in and I replace it with the data from the client or the data that I want in my business. So we're getting three pieces of information here. We're getting the method, which is post. we're getting the universal resource locator, and then we're getting the request content. We've already mucked around with the header, but if you think back to my earlier slide, those are the 4 pieces of information that you need: the header, the universal resource locator, the method, and then the request content. Everything else is templated. Everything else is just going to be the same basically every time. So actually go ahead and let's do this. I'm just going to drag these 2 tabs so they're really close together. Then I'm going to open up this Email Finder module, and I'm just going to paste in the URL. Remember that it said post, so I'm going to click method, I'll go to post. I already have my header here with the authorization and the bearer. And there are a couple of additional fields here that may look a little bit different to you. I always just do this. I mean, if I go back here and I pretend that all of this is empty and I haven't filled out anything, I always do this. Go to raw, and then content type, just go to application/JSON. This works more than 99% of the time. The vast majority of APIs are formatted in this way. The last thing we need to do is change the request content. So I'm going to go back to my API documentation here, and then I'm going to copy this, because this is the request content. And we know enough JSON now for this to be very clear. And by the way, I just pasted this in, Command V or Control V on Windows, and then as you see, it has a bunch of weird spacing. The reason why is because it's not taking the new lines in, it's just taking in the tabs. So if you wanted to preserve spacing, quick little hack is to right-click and then press Paste and Match Style. That'll basically all the time just match it to whatever it was in the example. Okay, and then what I want to do is, if you think about it, I'm looking for a specific person at a specific domain. So in my case, I'm going to type in leftclick.ai, and the person's full name is going to be Nick Sarayev. I'm going to click Parse Response as yes, and that's it. That's all you need in order to essentially create this API connection to a service that doesn't have like a built-in service or a built-in integration with make.com. This show advanced settings down here, I don't use any of this, so don't worry about it. I never use the username, the password, the timeout, share cookies with other HTTP modules, self-sign certificate, reject connections. I've worked with probably several hundred APIs at this point, and I haven't needed to do this. So odds are, unless you're working with a very legacy API or something that's just super non-standard, you're probably not going to need to do that as well. If there ends up being a demand for it, I'll make some videos on this, but I'm not going to now, simply because it's very, very, very rarely required or relevant. And even when it is, there's usually ways that you don't actually have to do this. You could just go back to using something like bearer authorization like I did above. Okay, great. So we've set everything up. It's now time for the moment of truth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click on this module and click Run this module only. This is functionally equivalent to clicking Run once, if you're curious. I just like doing it this way. And we're going to see what it says. So we just made a request. Status code was 200. When you receive a 200 status request, that typically tells you that everything was okay. As you see, if you guys remember, I talked about there being an HTTP request, and I also talked about there being an HTTP response. So this is the response right here. And you see the response also includes headers. So the response has a header called date, which stores the exact date that the request was made. It has one called content type, application JSON, right? It has one called content length. It has a bunch more. I'm not going to dive into every single one, but suffice to say that these are just standard ways that APIs communicate with each other, and they're standard pieces of information that allow people like you, integrators, to just have a little bit more metadata, a little bit more context to do cool stuff with. Hypothetically, maybe you wanted to know that the API was powered by Express. Express is just a library, or like a server library that allows you to run one of these APIs yourself. Now you know. So that's headers. If we go down to cookie headers, you'll see that that's empty. Sometimes this just stores information that's like hyper-specific to you, the user. Now the thing that we really want here is this data collection. And this data collection, like when you make an HTTP request to a resource and it returns a positive result, you'll always have something in this data collection. So you're always going to have to go into the data collection in order to get something. And you'll notice that there are two different collections here, or objects. The first is called input, and the second is called results. So input is just any mail finder. The specific API is providing you the same thing that you provided it, just in case you need it. And so this is the API just being nice and saying, hey, maybe you're going to need this domain name later. Hey, maybe you're going to need this full name later. I don't know. Obviously we don't, because we have that information previously, but maybe you're sending this information from one scenario and then you're retrieving it from another scenario or something like that. These conveniences are afforded to us by APIs to make our lives a little bit easier. All right, and then the thing that we're really looking for, at least in this specific API, right? Although all of your results will be in data, Different APIs have different conventions for whether it's called input, results, whatever, right? These are all variables that they came up with. But inside of this specific API, the results collection has an email, nick@leftclick.ai, and then a validation, which is valid, as well as some alternatives, which in this case are empty. You'll also see there's a success key value pair, and the value there is true. So this gives you a ton of information and a ton of possibilities, right? You could feed this into a flow that does different things based off whether the success is true, the success is false. The success is true. Maybe it takes this email address and it sends them an email or adds them to some different campaign or something like that. If it's false, maybe it goes through some other validation method, or maybe it tries to call their website to scrape a specific little snippet or something like that, right? A lot of options here, but essentially that's how you do one of the most basic types of API requests. All right, but one rep is not enough to grow giant freaking biceps. So what we're going to do is we're going to do this a few more times for different APIs. We just did this with an email finder. Why don't I exit out of there? And then why don't we also do this with Phantom Buster? So I'm going to open up Phantom Buster. Whew, excuse me. I actually already have Phantom Buster open over here. Good Lord. So, Phantom Buster. If you're unfamiliar with how Phantom Buster works, what it is it's like a scraping platform, which allows you to basically scrape things like LinkedIn leads. It allows you to run scrapers, I think, for Instagram as well. If I go to dashboard here, and then I say browse phantoms, you'll see there's just a variety of different things you could do. Scrape leads from LinkedIn company posts, connect with profiles on LinkedIn search. You could AI LinkedIn message writer, do DMs, Google Maps search, right? This is basically just a big scraping platform. And hypothetically, I talk a lot about this platform in my community because it helps us get leads that we then do email outreach to. But hypothetically, let's say you wanted to interact with this API, through make.com. You didn't want to have to do it manually. You wanted to do it all automatically. Well, what I'm going to do, as I did before, is I'm going to go to Phantom Buster. I'm going to type in API. You'll see that the first result is Phantom Buster API. Let's give that a click. It says you can programmatically control your Phantom Buster account, and then there's also an API reference right over here. So I'm just going to open that in a new tab. Let's just see what this looks like. Great. As we saw with the Email Finder API, it's organized in a very similar way. You have 3 columns. You have the endpoints on the left, then you have a description about them in the middle, and then on the right you have like actual examples of what this looks like. And this is a little bit more complex, but the good news is I'm going to be able to walk you through some different libraries that you could use. And ways to get the information that you need. So they misspelled that, losers. No, I'm just kidding. If we scroll down here, you'll see that there's a bunch of information. But again, the one that's the most important for us is this one here, authentication and request format. Because this is what's going to basically allow us to connect to the API. It's basically going to allow us to sign into our specific account, right? So these guys are great because they actually provide you like a whole breakdown, like a little GIF of how to access the API key. And they even provide you a link for convenience where they say your API resides in your workspace settings page. So if we just open this in a new tab, as you see down over here, third-party API key, I can click add API key. And this is the one over here that I want. So I'm just going to, they even have a little copy button. I'm going to copy my API key here. And I'll just go back and I'll see what else they say about it. How do we actually authenticate? Again, they're saying protect your API key. This is good convention. In my case, I'm going to delete all my API keys after this video, but don't go sharing this if you don't have to. All right, now we get to the good parts, the authentication part. How exactly do we connect with this API? Well, let's see. Authentication is dead simple. Put your API key in the x-phantombuster-key-1 HTTP header. You can also put it in the key query string parameter of every request that you make. Fantastic. Now, it looks like this is an API that actually gives us multiple ways to authenticate. We're going to use this one because this one's easier, but you can also authenticate using query strings, which are interesting as well, and I'll cover that briefly. So that's fantastic. This is exactly what we want. We just feed in this x-phantombuster-key. So why don't I go back here to my new module, and I'm just going to rename this and call this Phantom Buster. And let's just make this the trigger. And why don't I go over here and then change this header structure. So remember, before it was authorization and the value is bear space, whatever the API key is. Let me just refresh my memory here. It's x-phantombuster-key-1. So instead of authorization, it's this. And then we just paste the API key in. Again, people make API keys because they want you to use them. So they're going to tell you how to do so at some point. The unfortunate thing is some APIs are just written quite poorly, and some of them are nowhere near as straightforward and simple as otherwise. Okay, I'll cover how to do query parameters in a moment, but let's actually figure out what we want to do, like the endpoint that we want to specifically run. So why don't I go back here, and let me see what I got here. There are a bunch of different things we could do. As you see, they're organized into like branches. There's the orgs branch, which is just /orgs. There's containers, /containers. There's /branches, /agents, /scripts, /captcha, /AI. Oh, that's interesting. Huh. I didn't even know that we could use this for AI calls. Very, very cool. Org storage, right? All this stuff's pretty neat. I think what I'm going to do is I'm just going to export the agent usage, because that seems the simplest to me. And then we're just going to get some data that tells us, I guess, when the last time is that we used one of these phantoms. Just going to give us some information. So that seems pretty straightforward. Let's do that. Oh, and then it looks like the query parameters we feed in is the how many, excuse me, how many days of data to export. The number of days should not exceed 6 months. All right. So let's see what we can do here. And let me show you exactly how I would do this if I were to go out and like create this API request. We already have the authentication part. Granted, we haven't tested it yet, but we are going to test it here. As you see, Phantom Buster actually allows you to try and test stuff with the API key over here. So what I would do is before I even do the API request, I'd actually copy this and then I'd paste all of this stuff in. And then I'd just click try it to see what sort of data I could realistically look at. Okay, so it's saying you should have a required property called number of days. So I'm missing something, basically. I'm missing, yeah, it looks like I'm missing the days parameter. And that's because I need to fill this in here. Okay, so let's say I want to feed in 30 days right over here. Let's click try it. All right, so now it gave me a response. Looks like the response was not JSON, interestingly enough. It's a CSV, but that's okay. And that tells me that all of the information here is right. I just need now to format it in my own make.com scenario in order to make it work. So that's great. I have everything that I need right over here in this curl request. Curl is just like an old, again, it's another convention. It's another way to make a request that you used to do in the terminal. So you used to literally go into your terminal and you write curl like this. You type in the website, you press enter, and then you just get all of the website data. You get the HTML of the website specifically. So I could just copy all of this here, and then I could paste this all in here. And I'm getting a too many requests because it looks like I've just made like 3 or 4 requests in a second. That's okay. But essentially, this is just a way to do the same thing that we did earlier, just in our terminal. Okay, I think the reason why is because I have a bunch of these weird little dashes here. So I just need to remove these dashes. Oops. Okay, yeah, no, I guess it's just throttling me because I'm sending too many requests in too short a time. That said, keep in mind, I mentioned how the previous API did not have an API like rate limit. A lot of APIs do. So when you start sending too many requests too quickly or whatever, they'll throttle you, which is unfortunate. But that's okay. It's not the end of the world. What we're going to do instead is we're going to take this information, we're going to put it in a make scenario instead. So the way that I do is I'll actually usually look for like a curl request example because it has everything that I need. If you think about it, it has the URL right here, the universal resource locator. So all I do is I go all the way over here. And this is sort of cheating, and I'll tell you why in a second. So we're going to leave the Phantom Buster key. The method, as we saw, it's get. It's not post. The URL is over here. And you'll notice that this URL has a days parameter equal to 30. Now, this is technically called a query string parameter. Query strings are the exact same thing as the request content. It's just there for get requests instead of post requests. Let me give you an example. You see this here, which is JSON, which has a key called days and a value called 30. Well, this is functionally equivalent to what I wrote back over here. This days occurs after this question mark, and it's equal to 30. You don't actually have to memorize the formatting of this. You could just go to query string, and you could just do this. And that would be the same thing. If you remember, they mentioned that you could authenticate using query parameters as well. Well, you could actually just feed in the term key here, because that's what the API said, and then you could feed in the API key here. So if you didn't want to use the API key in the header, you could also use it down here. Sometimes APIs give you 3 or 4 ways to do the same thing, just because people have different conventions, how they like to do it. I personally just always like to use the one in the header, but that's my own convention, right? Okay, so time for the moment of truth. Let's give this API request a call. I'm wondering if we're going to be throttled. If we are, I'm just going to try a different API key, see what happens. Yeah, so it looks like we were throttled, which is interesting. So I'm going to go back over here, and then I'm going to try doing a different API key. Copy that. Sometimes changing your API key allows you to do more requests. No, it doesn't look like we could there. It could be that this API endpoint here just has a much lower rate limit. So why don't we try this other one here, export container usage. So why don't I, instead of calling that previous universal resource locator, I'm just going to copy this other resource locator. Go back here and then paste this in. We'll have a days parameter equal to 30 as well. And okay, so that one worked. So it must just be that the other URL endpoint has a much lower rate limit. That's all right. You're going to find weird quirks of APIs like this now and again. But as you see, this is the same structure that we're used to. There's headers, there's cookie headers, and then there's data. Now, instead of data being JSON, it looks like this API returns this specific data as a CSV. CSV just stands for comma-separated value, where you basically have like tabular data. This is something you could import into a Google Sheet pretty easily. ID, URL, agent name, right? And then you actually start having like the values themselves. That's okay. I'm not going to talk about like what you would do with this data because that's beyond the purpose of this video. But just know that we successfully, authenticated to this Phantom Buster API, and we did something pretty cool with it. And that's sort of the second way that you can communicate with APIs or authenticate with them. That's still in the header, mind you. Okay, let's go on to a third example here. Instead of this, why don't we do, what was my next example? Instantly. Just because I personally use Instantly all the time. Figured I'd give you guys a practical example of how that works. Okay, so what do we want to do with Instantly? We just want to go to a campaign here, and then we just want to add a lead to a campaign. So I have a campaign here, US Creative Agencies with Personalization. Instantly is cold email software if you're unfamiliar. And all I want to do is I just want to add a lead to that campaign. That sounds pretty fun. So in order to do this, what am I going to do? I'm going to type in Instantly API. And then I'm going to find the Instantly API documentation, which is right over here. And then I love how clear this API is. It literally explicitly tells you what your API key is. Fantastic. So you need to be on the hypergrowth plan or above to be able to access the API key. Now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know if I'm on the hypergrowth plan with this account. All right, so I was actually using the wrong account, but I'm using the right one now. So essentially what we have to do is, let's go back to this API documentation. It says finding your API key. The first step to using Instantly is to find your API key. The API key helps authenticate your incoming request and is unique per Instantly workspace. To get your API key, go to Instantly Dashboard Settings Integrations API, or go right over down here. So I'm just going to copy this link address. I love when they provide it for us. I'm going to paste this in. Okay, great. And then what we have to do is we have to go down here to Instantly API, and then I'm just going to copy this API key. And now I'm going to go down, and you'll see that these guys, along with having the same structure, right, with the table of contents on the left-hand side and the text in the middle, and then like some examples on the right, they say once you have your API key, send a GET request to ensure everything is ready. Very, very cool. They have an endpoint called Authenticate, which we could just use to test. So in order to do so, all we have to do is pass the API key. Looks like in the query string itself. Isn't that interesting? And they provide us an example that we can basically copy and paste to give this a go. So why don't I just do that? Why don't I show you guys how to do one of these testing flows? So I'm going to move this over here. This is now going to be the trigger for my whole scenario. And then what do I want to do? Let me just double check here. So what do we get? We get it's a GET request. This is the universal resource locator over here. This is the API key over here. So why don't we just give this a go? I will just paste in my API key, and then I'm just going to paste in this too, just to show you guys that these are functionally equivalent. I could have used a key called API key, and then I could have pasted that down over here. But to be honest, it's functionally equivalent to just writing it like this, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, let's give this a run. Let's see what happens. All right, so we received a 200 status code, and it gives us our workspace name. Looks like this is Instantly API's testing function, and it looks like we passed with flying colors. They have some rate limits down here, 10 requests per second. That seems pretty fine to me. And then what did I really want to do? I wanted to, I think, add a lead to a campaign, right? So let's see here. I go to campaign, add leads to a campaign. Yeah, so this is what I want to do. This is probably a little bit more realistic of a function, so let's go for it. Now, you'll notice that although the test function was a get, to actually use the API, it looks like you need to use post. So there's a little bit of a difference there. And there's also a ton of data here that we feed in, basically, which is a lot more complex than anything else that we had to do before. Notice that the way that we're feeding this into is using the request content. It's not using the query string. It's not using anything else. We're actually using the request content, which is that big JSON thing. So I'm going to show you exactly how I would do this if I were tasked with this, either for my own business or for somebody else. I'd quickly make note of the URL, universal resource locators, right over here. Then I'd look at the request type, which the method would be post. I'd look at this big object and I think, man, that's a huge ass object. What the heck is this object about? And then I'd be like, oh, right, you know what? It's JSON. Because it's JSON, that's probably going to be request content. So I'm going to copy all of these over one by one. So I'll start with this. I'll go back over here, zoom in, give it a click, paste. Okay. Oh, you know what? I should keep my API key. All right, hold on. I'm going to paste this, and then I'm going to steal my API key out of there. Put that there just for now. It's a little placeholder. I'm going to change the method to post. I'm going to go back here. What else do we got? And then we have the data raw. Notice how we have an API key, campaign ID, skip if in workspace, skip if in campaign, all these different parameters. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy. Let's just copy this whole thing. That'll be a little bit easier. I'm going to go down here and I'm just going to paste it all in. Oops, let's paste it in nice like this. And then all I want is, remember we talked about JSON earlier, right? So all I really want is this JSON. So I'm going to delete this. I'm going to take this API key, copy that, and I'm going to put it where it says API underscore key. And then there's a campaign ID. Now, I already know what the campaign ID is, but usually the ID of something on an app or a resource like this is almost always going to be in the URL. So if you zoom in up at the very top of this, you'll see that I have some long-winded campaign ID with a bunch of these random letters and numbers. If I just copy that in, go back here, and paste it, you see that it fits basically exactly. And then I have an object called leads. And it looks like, I have a key called leads with a value, and that value is a big array. So I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger here so y'all can see. But it looks like we have two objects buried within that array. So I don't actually need two objects. I only need one object because I just want to test this with a single email. So I'm going to remove this second object, which that should be good. And then I'm just going to go over here and then add my own information. And then I'm going to add a good little phone number. I'm going to add my own website here. My favorite restaurant is Pho Daddy, just a couple blocks away from my house. My language is English. Okay, so I had to make a couple of changes there. Oh, and then I'm going to remove this final backtick here. I had to make a couple changes to the structure in order to make it work. I had to remove a few things. So what I'm going to do just to make sure that I'm fine is I'm going to go over here to jasonformatter.org. I'm just going to paste all of this in, and then I'm going to click validate. Sorry, I'm going to click format and beautify. If you click format and beautify, and then it gives you an error, like if I were to do this and then click format and beautify, it says that there's an error. It'll usually tell you where the error is, and you can just fix it like that. And so I just did this really quickly, just make sure that that's fine. Looks good to me. I'm going to go back here. I'm going to just paste that in, and we'll click OK. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right-click this, and we're going to see whether or not this worked, whether or not our API call was successful. It looks like the status of this API request was success. Total sent 1, leads uploaded, in block list, skip count, invalid email count, duplicate email count. I wasn't expecting any of these keys or values. The only one I was really wondering whether I'd get is the success one. But just notice how it instantly structures their API a little bit differently than most other platforms do. So that's how Instantly did it, which looks pretty cool. All right, and the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to run you through how to do OAuth 2. All of the API requests we've made up until now have been using this make a request module. Now I'm going to go down to make an OAuth 2 request. Now I'm going to run pretty quickly over this simply because the vast majority of the requests you're going to make are not going to be OAuth 2 requests. And OAuth 2 requests are just very annoying to do, to be completely honest. But that's okay. I'll show you how to do it anyway. For a platform called DeviantArt. DeviantArt is just like a big art platform. They used to be really big, like, 5, 10-ish years ago. I don't think they're anywhere near as big now, but it looks like AI art has just completely taken over their platform, by the way. That's so funny. I think most people here like absolutely hate AI art, which is funny. Or maybe they used to until it just like took over, man. Like all of this stuff's AI art. That's so funny. Okay. I say this as somebody that used to run an AI art website, and I routinely get artists shitting on me being like, this isn't real art. How could you? And it's like, yeah, I understand your concerns. I do. But technology's here and there's not much you can do about it. Okay. So the make an OAuth 2.0 request looks different. You have all the same information that you have underneath here, but you also have this HTTP connection section. What you need to do is you need to click add. And there are a couple of quirks here. Let's just go nick at leftclick.ai, and let's call this aug12-2024. There are a couple of quirks here, okay? And these quirks can be pretty difficult to understand if you're not used to any of this. So I'm not going to go and explain the details behind each of these fields. I'm just going to show you that if you want to make an OAuth 2 request, just like there was an API key and the APIs had instructions on how to use them, these APIs will give you the authorized URI, token URI, client ID, client secret fields. They'll just give you everything that you need, essentially. All you need to do is just pump it all in here. So the way they do this in DeviantArt is you need to go up to deviantart.com/developers. And this is just specific to their API. I just typed in like DeviantArt API. And they need to register your application. So I'm going to register a new application. I'm just going to call this example OAuth 2 request. You're going to select an OAuth 2 grant type. Mine's going to be authorization code. If you click back here, notice how they have the two same settings, authorization code or implicit. You could pick either, but I'm going to do authorization code because it's a little bit more complex. Then it says OAuth 2 redirect URI whitelist. Now this is the thing that trips up 99% of people that try connecting stuff with OAuth 2. Anytime you see a redirect URI, when you're designing or creating or publishing or registering your app or whatever, what you need to do is you need to go to integrament OAuth 2 URL, and then you need to get this specific URL here. And that's what you need to use in order for your whole OAuth 2 flow to work. You need to copy this URL, and that's the one you need to add into whatever the redirect URI section is. I'm also going to put a whitelist in for Integromat. I don't think you actually need to do that, mind you. And then I'm going to, in this case for DeviantArt, I'm just going to disable comments and stuff like that because I don't want people commenting on my app. My app is just a test app anyway. And for whatever reason, there's no way you can publish like a secret app on DeviantArt. It has to be a public app or something, which is kind of dumb. Anyway, then I'm just going to go back here where it says your applications and keys. And then just notice how there's published applications. Oh, okay, yeah, I guess the OAuth 2 redirect URL whitelist is required, so I'm going to publish this. Oh, I do not know what happened there. My bad. I think it was this one here. I don't actually know, but probably. So then you're going to go to your application. You'll notice there's a client ID and a client secret. So I'm going to paste in the client ID. I'll go over here, show this, and then I'll paste in the client secret as well. And then you'll notice there's an authorized URI, token URI. It's okay. It's going to explain all of this for us in a second. I'm then going to go to authentication. It's going to give me a big breakdown of how authentication works, authorization code, implicit, client credentials. The one that I care about is how to use the authorization code grant. So it's going to teach me that I need to put this essentially in the authorization URI, which is right over here. Then I'm going to scroll down here to where it says getting a user access token. I'm going to copy this one, put it in the user access token URI. And then there's one more kind of gotcha, which a lot of these API documentations won't tell you about, unfortunately. But it's about specifically how to, basically how to give yourself permissions. And so all of these OAuth 2 API requests are going to include a scope. And a scope is just a very granular way of granting permissions to you, a person that's going to do a connection. And so you need to do this specific to an API, but I know for sure that DeviantArt has a permission called browse. There's one called the browse daily deviation endpoint, and it says the following scopes are required to access this resource explicitly. I need to provide a scope called browse. So in order for me to do this connection, I actually have to go down here and I actually have to physically write browse. Now what's happening behind the hood is I'm basically going onto DeviantArt and I'm providing all of these details, the client ID, the client secret, the token URI, the authorized URI, and then in DeviantArt I have to like provide that integromat URL. And then what's happening is when I click save, what it's going to do is it's going to open a DeviantArt window right in front of me here. And it's going to say, hey, do you authorize make.com or integromat to go in and use our DeviantArt application to do things like make API calls? So if I click save here, as you see, we're getting an authorizing window. And because I've already clicked accept, it just opened and closed instantly. But it's going to say, hey, do you authorize make.com to come in? You click authorize or accept, and then voila, you have your connection. And now all you do is you do the same thing you did before. Here's the URL. I'm going to copy this in, paste it in. Looks like the parameters here are get and then date. So I don't actually need it because it's optional. So I'm just going to go to get request here. I'm going to click parse response. We'll go body type raw, content type application JSON, click OK. I'm going to right click this. And you'll see here that I got a 200 status code, which means that my request was successful. And it looks like they gave me a bunch of, I don't know, URLs of cool art. Let's open that puppy up. That's pretty dope, man. Ooh, yeah. That's a cool signature. I wonder if AI came up with that. No, looks like a person actually did. Wonderful. Yeah. So that is more or less it. That's how to make API requests using 3 fundamental different types. One where you put your API request in the header, another where you put it in the request content, and then the last one where you do it through OAuth 2. I'm going to full screen this and then go to the last page and wish everybody good luck and congratulations on making it this far. If you've kept with me until now, you know more about how to make API connections and how to structure the HTTP module than probably 95% of other people on make.com. And that's even if you had no programming background, no understanding of JSON, no nothing. So to reiterate, there are a couple points I just want you to keep in mind moving forward. The first is that HTTP is just a way to structure the text of a request. It's a protocol for hypertext transfer. It's just an opinionated convention. It's just a way that people started doing things a while ago, agreed on, and it's just sort of how we have to structure our requests now. Make makes it easy for us by providing a bunch of structured fields like the URL, the header, and the method. You can use these fields in the way that I've shown you to communicate with APIs very easy. And because we're using make.com, and make.com is pretty awesome. I mean, if it wasn't, I would not have built several businesses around it. As long as you keep in mind the 3 major ways that you can connect with, authorize, authenticate, and then interact with APIs, you'll be good. To reiterate, there was the authorization flow here. Phantom Busters had an x-phantombuster-key-1. Instantly just had the API key directly in the request body. And then OAuth 2 basically just had 3 or 4 different API keys. They were just called something different. I really loved putting this video together. Love talking about make.com and specifically about HTTP requests and APIs because it's just such like a big point of contention both in my community and on the internet. You have everything that you need now to get out there and crush it. If you have any questions, please leave a comment down below and I'll get to it. Otherwise, if you guys could do me a big favor, like, subscribe, do all the rest of that fun YouTube stuff. And I'll catch you on the next video. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.